get important information from social media sources faster than from traditional media sources that would take, hours to write something and edit and vet and then publish on a website or print onto hard paper. Whereas going to X, for example, you can get the information so fast. But the mixed blessing also is that a lot of that information shared really quickly can be wrong, and can be sometimes it can be inadvertently wrong, and sometimes it can be maliciously wrong.
There's a piece in the New York Times today about this very thing regarding the hospital bombing and how the headlines were constantly changing, how how the story was written and rewritten over and over again because nothing from either side could be verified. And the article noted that it took the Times something like 12 days to verify, I think it was in Bucha, to verify what happened in Bucha. And that, verification takes time, but that, nothing stops the drumbeat of this constant flow of information on social media.
Yes, I agree. I think when I saw what was happening with the hospital bombing, reporting, I was really, really concerned about how these issues, the platforms, the channels, the urge to quickly put things out could actually impact journalism as a profession. Right. Nobody wants to wait again. And I've also been looking at what is happening on social media. There is this aggressive push for influencing the conversations on how, and a lot of stakeholders that would be championed. And like Michael said, independent verification seems to be a major challenge that takes a longer time compared with how quickly things are really evolving. And it's quite concerning about what the future of journalism, war reporting is going to look like. And I'm also seeing that we have a lot of people already that are joining us. So I want to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And probably you've heard some of the conversations that I've been having with the panelists. And very soon you would also be part of the conversation. And I'm really, really glad that you are joining us to discuss and learn about this very, very, very important issue, and the fact that the pace at which the information is evolving, and we are getting a lot of stories from different outlets, from different channels, from different sources, put journalism again at the center of efforts to propagate the truth, to communicate the truth, and to combat misinformation and disinformation. And I always say that we've been hearing about these crises, this development. I've read extensively about some of the issues that this current crisis is built around. We've been hearing about them for decades, but something seems to be different this particular moment, which is the quick pace at which information dissemination is happening, with journalism to a large extent playing catch up. And when news is a particular channel has published a particular story, the other channels would want to play catch up with it and try to build around what has been reported. But what happens when what has been reported is false, is wrong, or is improperly, or is quite misleading? The impact of that could actually be extensively far-reaching. And there are also issues around who to trust as journalists. How are you sure that you are getting the true state of what is happening on the field? And how do you actually project what you are doing? How can you focus your stories to do more good than doing more harm. So those are the kinds of issues that we hope we can have that conversation around today. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the Community Manager for the International Center for Journalists Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. And today we're having a Dow Jones webinar, and we'll be discussing the major developments happening in Israel, Gaza, and the Israel-Gaza conflict, what journalists that are covering what should know. And I'm glad that I'm being joined by two very, very knowledgeable experts in their respective fields. Let me start by welcoming multimedia journalist Michael Lipin, who covers international affairs as a Voice of America bridge editor. Hi, Michael. How are you doing today? And thank you for joining us.
I'm great, Paul. Thank you.
So Michael produces and hosts VOA's weekly podcast, which is Flashpoint Iran. He has also done multiple assignments in Israel, interviewing senior political and military figures about Israel-Iran tension, and covering Israel's April 2019 Knesset election and the 2017 and 2018 visits of US President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence to Jerusalem, which is Israel's US recognized capital. I also want to say a big welcome to Steven Youngblood, who is the founding director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University in Parkville, Missouri, US. Hi, Steven. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, so at the Center for Global Peace Journalism, Steven is a communication and peace studies professor. He has organized and taught peace journalism webinars, seminars, and workshops in 44 countries and territories. He also served as a U.S. State Department Senior Subject Specialist in Ethiopia in 2018. Youngblood is the author of Peace Journalism, Principles and Practice. He also edits the Peace Journalist magazine and writes and produces the Peace Journalism Insight blog. He has been recognized for his contribution to world peace by the U.S. State Department, Rotary International, and the World Forum for Peace, which named him a Luxembourg Peace Prize laureate for 2020-2021. So thanks, gentlemen, for joining us today. And I'm going to start this conversation with Michael and to give us a brief introduction. But there is a point that I want to make, which was that this issue has been a very, very serious one. And even when we had posts to announce this particular session, even some journalists were debating, we're arguing over the captioning of the conversation. Everything that you say, everything that you mention, the keywords regarding this development has to be carefully and navigated. You are aware of this issue for much longer than I have. You've been covering this issue for much longer than people like me are aware of it. And so let me know your thoughts on this and help us put the development and the crisis into a sharper perspective.
Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and I look forward to the conversation also with Steven. And Paul, you're right. Often covering this conflict can be a minefield for a journalist, and I'm looking forward to questions from the audience. But yes, when you answer, you do have to think carefully about the words that you use. So I'm going to do my best to provide thoughtful answers as best I can to the questions from audience members. But what I'd like to do is talk for about 5 minutes to begin with about two main things that could be useful for our audience members to know. One is how do I have some experience and expertise in covering the Arab-Israeli conflict, and secondly, what ideas can I share with our audience members about how to better cover this conflict? So when it comes to my experience, firstly, Paul mentioned that I've been on a number of reporting assignments to Israel for VOA, That was 4 trips from 2017 to 2019. I've also traveled extensively within Israel. I've been up and down the country, from the very north to the very south, and a lot of places in between. My last visit was actually in September 2022. So that was just a year before this war started. I was actually part of a group of American journalists doing a tour of Israel with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It is a Washington, D.C. think tank, a nonpartisan organization that has a hawkish approach to U.S. foreign policy. And they organized this tour for about 15 or so journalists, myself and a few other VOA journalists. And they actually took us to some of the very hot spots, some of the scenes of some of the most serious incidents of this war so far. For example, it was in September last year that I was in Kfar Aza, which is actually a kibbutz, an Israeli kibbutz near the border with Gaza, which was the scene of one of the worst massacres on October 7th by the Hamas group. I also went to a vantage point about maybe a kilometer from the border fence with Gaza, and I had some binoculars. I looked across the way. We were also taken all the way to the north with to the Israeli-Lebanese border, and even the Israeli-Syrian border in the Golan Heights. And on the Lebanese border, we were even taken into a tunnel by the Israeli military that Hezbollah had dug underneath the Lebanese-Israeli border, that the Israeli military discovered some years ago, and they closed off. So I have that experience of being all over Israel, being on its borders where a lot of the fighting is happening right now. And I've also I'm quite familiar with Israeli news sources, both official news sources, governmental, military news sources, private news sources, Israeli media, publishing in both English and Hebrew. I have some Hebrew skills. I'm a conversational Hebrew speaker, but not fluent. I also have a network of contacts that I've made over the years with Israeli military and security experts, both current officials and former officials. And I do call upon them a lot when I'm doing my reporting. I also, of course, have some familiarity with Palestinian politics and with Palestinian news sources. The second thing I wanted to share right now is that I'm happy to talk about my experiences of being in these different parts of Israel where the war is currently happening. I'm happy to also answer questions about how I apply certain principles to the way I cover the Arab-Israeli conflict. A lot of my reporting, I base all of my reporting basically on following VOA's charter and VOA's best practices when it comes to sourcing, when it comes to the way I use language on things like terrorism, when it comes to how I try to make my stories balanced. And I can even share some examples of how I apply those concepts to some of my recent work, whether it's articles I've written for the web or podcasts that I produce like Flashpoint Iran. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And so I was here, and before I know you've given your overview, but want to go a little bit, I want to go a little bit deeper with you, which is to actually discuss some of your reporting. And one of the things that I like about when I was looking at the kinds of stories that you've produced is the fact that we can approach, there are different motive reporting on this war could be seen from a multifaceted insight. So let's talk about what you've done in recent times. For those that don't know, I think this is Michael's page on the VOA.
Yes, this is my bio page.
So let's
talk about for giving it a plug.
So let's talk about the stories that you've done in the latest chapter of the crises. Let's go through them and your process to putting them together. Probably it could inspire and guide some journalists that are trying to report on this, but are very careful about, but have been discouraged about how to carefully navigate the various critical issues that are flashpoints.
Sure. My focus for the last year at VOA has been covering Iran. I'm the host, as you mentioned, of the weekly podcast Flashpoint Iran. And basically, what I'm doing with that podcast and the articles that I write that use interviews from my podcast, I am looking at all kinds of malign things that Iran is doing to its own people in terms of suppressing of internal dissent, and also Iran's malign activities in the region and in the world, its involvement in regional and international conflicts. And as we all know, two of Iran's proxies, two Palestinian group Hamas and Lebanese group Hezbollah, that are allies of Iran, that Iran provides monetary and weaponry to in terms of support. Those two groups are currently engaged in hostilities with Israel directly, Hamas from Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there is an Iranian connection to the current conflict. And it's a natural thing for me to discuss on the podcast with guests. How is Iran connected? How deeply? What are Iran's interests and motivations? What are the relationships like between the Iranian government and its proxy forces in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon? So that's a lot of my focus is not just looking at, let's say, the tit for tat rocket fire by Hamas and how Israel responds, but I really try to look at this conflict from a wider perspective, how it involves other actors in the region. So I have been taking a broader view, looking primarily at Iran's connection. The degree of Iran's involvement is something that is a very sensitive, touchy subject, because while Iran has praised the Hamas attacks on Israel, Iran has not said explicitly that we ordered that terror assault on Israel. We decided the timing. We decided when and where Hamas would strike. Iran hasn't said that. Not even Hamas has really said that all of that was Iran's decision, but we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. So it's also a matter of debate within the United States. A key element of my reporting for VOA is what is the U.S. view of the fighting, of the war, of the various warring parties, and of Iran. And there's a big debate politically, domestically within the U.S. about how deeply connected Iran is to the war and how it started, what the U.S. should do about that. That's something we can get into a bit later. But for example, one of the early articles that I wrote, I think it was published on October 8th, was an article about how Iran was engaged in some kind of coordination with its proxy forces in the region in the weeks and months leading up to the Hamas assault on Israel. And for that story, I reached out to various sources. I contacted a former Israeli national security advisor, Yaakov Amidror. He was one of the people I quoted. I also tried to gather evidence, examples, who was meeting who, which Hamas officials were meeting with Iranian officials, at what place, at what time, what was the nature of the meetings, what was discussed. Jason Brodsky, a policy advisor for the US advocacy group United Against Nuclear Iran, was another source whom I contacted for the story. I also used some interviews that my colleagues at VOA Persian did. And basically, I was trying to piece together as much information as I could, just to kind of lay out factually what these meetings were, who was involved, when and where, and the assessment of some observers that there appeared to be this close coordination between Iran and those other groups leading up to the attack. The article isn't saying that Iran ordered the Hamas assaults, and in fact, Yaakov Amidjor, whom I interviewed for the story, the former national security advisor of Israel, said, we don't see any direct sign of that yet. And that was also the assessment of the US government. So I had to make sure that those points of view were expressed in the story as well. And I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And one last question before we go to Steven. I think if I would bring two key messages that you've shared regarding how journalists can actually cover the development. First of all, is looking at how it affects your country. What is your country's stakeholders' position on what is happening at the moment? And another thing that I also could take from what you've described is being less focused on tit-for-tat journalism, but focusing more on the broader issues could protect you against contributing to disinformation and fast churn-out journalism errors that we've seen currently at the current chapter. Do you agree with me?
Yes, I do. And that story that I put out on October 8th is an example of that, because there were allegations flying around very soon after the Hamas assault in Israel began that, Iran, everyone knows Iran is a big backer of Hamas, all those years of financial support, providing weapons. So, there was this allegation felt by many Israelis, actually, that, Iran must have ordered this. So while the temptation might be for some in the media to jump to that conclusion, this obviously is an Iran-ordered attack on Israel, what I tried to do is just lay out the facts as they are, and the assessment of credible observers and experts who monitor these things. What is their assessment? What's the assessment in the United States? And the message that came out of that article was it's more complicated than just saying Iran ordered this. There were all these coordinated meetings, what appeared to be coordinated meetings in the run-up, but that's all we can say, because that's all that we knew at the time in terms of what was going on between Iran and its proxies. So that is the kind of journalism that I think is more productive and useful when it comes to explaining what's happening with this war.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. We are going to take questions. Please put your questions, if you're on the Zoom platform, put your questions on the Q&A option. I've seen questions for Michael in the chat box. And when we are back with the panel discussion, we are going to take all of the questions. But please, we will take those ones that you've already put in the chat box, because we are just giving the instruction. But further questions should please go to the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. And if you are watching, we are live on HiGenet, our Facebook page, and of course the ICFJ Pamela World Forum's Facebook page also. You can also be part of this conversation. Put your questions under the chat, under the video, in the comment box below the video that you are watching right now. And I'm glad to bring Steven to this conversation. If you one of the things that that is really, really obvious with the crisis is the level of polarization. And the more you try to report that this has happened on this side, we will always see that intentional and response, people taking this issue too personal because of how it is affecting them on an individual basis. And if you look at the chat box too, we've had some interesting comments for for lack of better words, that actually shows how individuals feel about this story, including some journalists about this issue. So, but peace journalism is an interesting concept, and potentially one area that I believe many journalists and players in the media ecosystem can agree upon. And probably its influence could be one of the ways that we can be able to have some agreement and make some progress about the kinds of journalism and the goal of the kinds of stories that we do. So in a short while, we are going to hear from Steven about the concept of peace journalism and probably how it can be adapted and integrated into our current reporting of the current crisis. Steven?
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Michael. So much of what you talked about really is peace journalism, about being careful about the language that's being used, about looking at the wider perspective and context, very important in peace journalism. And one of the things we'll talk about as well is embracing complexity. And certainly it seems that when we're reporting this, that we have really no other choice. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about peace journalism in an introductory way. I'm speaking to you from Chisinau, Moldova, where I am on a Fulbright scholarship this academic year, lecturing and teaching about peace journalism and about disinformation. It's interesting, ironic that when I came to Moldova, of course, I thought I would always be speaking about the Ukraine war, since Moldova is bordered on 3 sides by Ukraine. So it's interesting that here we are tonight talking about another war, but in peace journalism terms, talking about the same sorts of principles. So tonight I'm going to give you, or today on your time, it's night here in Chisinau, I'm going to give you an overview of some definitions and characteristics of peace journalism. And then we'll talk a little bit about how peace journalism can inform the coverage of this conflict. So you see before you some definitions of peace journalism. I'm not going to read through these, you can read them. But essentially what we're talking about is when reporters and editors are making choices that can improve the prospects for peace, that can create an atmosphere that's conducive to peace. So what kind of choices are we talking about? Word choice is very important. We'll talk about this a little later. Are these words demonizing? Are they inflammatory? Or instead, are they more neutral? We're talking about the use of images as well. That's another important choice that's made by journalists. We're talking about framing. How do we tell the story? Are we giving peacemakers a voice? Are we leading discussions about peace? Interesting to note, but important, is what peace journalism is not. So what peace journalism is not is open advocacy for peace. So we are not saying there must be peace, but what we are doing is leading societal discussions about peace. Peace journalism is also not good news reporting. So we're not ignoring when bad things happen. If a bomb goes off and people are killed, it's news and it must be reported. So the question is, how is it reported? Is it reported in such a way, and this is a phrase I use often, that it puts gasoline on the fire? So at minimum, peace journalism is looking to not exacerbate the situation, to not make a bad situation worse. So real quickly, here are some principles of peace journalism. That peace journalism is proactive, examining the causes of conflict and looking for ways to encourage dialogue before violence occurs. So peace journalism leads discussions about solutions. Secondly, peace journalism rejects us versus them models. What do I mean by that? Traditional journalism oftentimes puts one group against another. So in the United States, it might be Trump supporters versus others. It might be North versus South, Black versus white. On a global stage, it might be the Christian world versus the Muslim world. And of course, in this conflict, there are many us versus them. An example of a peace journalism project that builds bridges instead of giving into us versus them narratives is a project that I did with the U.S. Institute of Peace, a 3-year project that brought together 80 Pakistani and Indian journalists. And what we did was we put these journalists into teams, and jointly they reported issues of common concern. They didn't report about the conflict. They didn't report about politics, but what they did report about was about the economy, was about the environment, was about gender issues. Basically, every imaginable area but the conflict. So that's what we mean by peace journalism building bridges. Thirdly, peace journalists reject propaganda from any source, instead seeking factual information from multiple sources, the kinds of things that Michael does. Fourthly, peace journalism rejects overly simple portrayals of issues and people. So whenever we see groups portrayed as a monolith, we know that that's not going to be accurate reporting. And the same when we see reporting that reinforces stereotypes. Again, that's something Michael addressed, is how complex these issues are. Number 5, peace journalism gives a voice to the voiceless. So instead of just reporting for and about elites, are we giving everyday people a voice? And I think we have seen some of this in the coverage of the war in Israel, that we've heard from the voices of survivors. As you see, I ask on the screen, when we are interviewing survivors, is it done respectfully or is it done in a way that could re-traumatize? So there's a whole genre of journalism that talks about trauma and trauma reporting. Sixthly, I don't think that's a word. Number 6, peace journalists provide depth and context rather than just superficial and sensational blow-by-blow accounts. Again, something that Michael addressed, rather than just, what building was bombed here, what diplomat visited whom. Instead of just the sort of play-by-play, to use a sports metaphor, peace journalists look for something deeper than that. Look at that wider perspective, as Michael called it. Peace journalists consider the consequences of their reporting. So if I report this story in this way, using these words and these images, what happened? What happens? Am I making angry people angrier? Am I worsening polarization? Am I pouring gasoline on the fire? At minimum, peace journalism seeks to not make a bad situation worse. Number 8, the language is tremendously important in peace journalism. Are we using language that's subjective? Are we using language that's sensational? Do we say 10 people were slaughtered in a bloody massacre? Or do we say 10 people were killed? So that's one of the things that peace journalists consider. So when do we use words like massacre and tragedy, bloodbath? We'll see that word used in a few moments. Terrorist, atrocity. We have to be very careful with the word terrorist, something that Michael mentioned, because we know one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Peace journalism also entails careful selection of images, because we understand that images can misrepresent an event, can exacerbate an already dire situation, or can re-victimize those who have suffered. So when I teach this in the classroom, we look at a number of images and talk about, are those images appropriate? One example I always use is Alan Kurdi, the 2-year-old Syrian boy He was trying to escape the war, and he died in the Mediterranean, and his body washed up in Turkey. Do we use an image like that? I hope that we're thoughtful in whatever selection we make. And finally, number 10, peace journalists offer counter narratives that debunk media created or perpetuated stereotypes, myths, and misperceptions. So here in this part of the world, we talk about media narratives about Russians, that all Russians think this, that all Russians believe that. So a peace journalist would look to add some nuance to that discussion and not just paint all Russians with the same very broad brush. So this is a quick overview of peace journalism. Now, the question on our collective minds then is, how does this apply to the coverage of the Gaza-Hamas conflict? Let's take a few moments and talk about that. So because the conflict is new, we don't really have the kind of objective data that a professor like me looks for. So rather than offer my analysis of the coverage, keeping in mind it would be nothing but superficial, I have some questions in mind about the coverage, questions that as journalists we can ask ourselves, and as audience members we can ask ourselves about the news that we're consuming. So here we go. Number one, does the coverage present all victims as worthy? Are all innocent lives treated equally in the storytelling? Are all of those traumatized treated with empathy and sensitivity? Or have they been re-traumatized? And are the voices of victims, including the displaced, are these voices being heard as well? Secondly, do the stories and images accurately portray suffering on all sides? Or is suffering shown 98% us and 2% them? And is their suffering sanitized in some way? So video, for example, taken of long shots of buildings burning without any closer on the ground video that shows people and what's happened to these people. Thirdly, is the coverage contextual? So in this instance, does it explain but not excuse the attack by Hamas? Is the blockade of Gaza mentioned? Is Hamas's commitment to destroying Israel mentioned? So that's the context for this story. Number four, are the media disseminating only factual, verified information and images? Are the images used authentic? Is propaganda unwittingly being circulated in mainstream news platforms and on social media? And what about viral videos? Are viral videos that may be inaccurate, are they being shared as well? I'm going to play you a quick little snippet of a piece from CNN that talks about this very issue.
And also tonight, Ardoni O'Sullivan on the viral videos about this war that are having huge impact. They're completely fake, but they're having dire consequences.
One video shows a rocket purportedly fired by Hamas. Another video claims to show Israeli jets bombing Gaza, but neither is real. This video is actually footage from a video game called Arma 3. And this is actually video of soccer celebrations in Algeria. It's all part of a tidal wave of viral mis- and disinformation circulating around the Israel-Hamas conflict. Adi Cohn works with Mamitica, an online threat intelligence service. He's been monitoring misinformation like this, a fake BBC News report that falsely claimed Ukraine had provided weapons to Hamas.
This is relatively sophisticated stuff. I mean, it's got even the same kind of graphic set as the BBC News normally would have.
Right, and I think what happened over recent years, that it becomes very easy, affordable to mimic those graphics, visualization.
And so we see there in this instance, that there's a large problem, in essence, with these fake videos and in general with false information. So the fifth question we can ask is, does this coverage generalize, scapegoat, or demonize the so-called other side in the conflict? Number 6, is there any discussion of peace or any discussion of peaceful alternatives to war, no matter how remote they might seem? Are peacemakers given a voice, or is peace simply mentioned in passing and summarily dismissed? So I did a small study that I presented at a conference in Greece that shows that for the Ukraine war, that this is not the case. Indeed, my study showed that by a 5-to-1 margin, that any mentions of peace or peaceful resolutions were outnumbered 5-to-1 by the simple reporting about the tactics of the war, the weapons of the war, and so on. Furthermore, my research showed that when peace was mentioned, that 41.8% of the time that it was summarily dismissed. So yes, we mention peace in this war, but then we say, but peace won't work. Peace is not possible, that the peace favors Russia. So it was very dismissive of peace. And I suspect, though I have no proof, that the same can be said right now of reporting regarding this particular conflict. Number 7, what are the consequences of the reporting that we see? So I've said it before and I'll say it again. Do we see reporting that puts gasoline on the fire, that makes peace less possible, that in fact embraces violence and embraces violence as the only viable solution to the conflict? Number 8, on social media, are journalists actively combating falsehoods about the Israel-Hamas war, no matter which side that they benefit? Are they pre-bunking anticipated themes of information? So this is an article that talks about the BBC and how the volume of misinformation on Twitter especially was beyond anything that they've ever seen. There's an article in today's New York Times, in fact, that talks about the same sort of phenomena. And I show this because I love this quote: you have to be 100% certain before publishing and show the audience why something is false. So I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Number 9, is the coverage biased? Does it simplify the situation into good guys and bad guys? It goes back to the complexity that we talked about earlier. And finally, number 10, is the coverage sensational, both in language and in images? Are bloody, horrifying images being used because they are needed to tell the story, or are they used as clickbait? Are they used in a way that's simply sensational? Are the images and storytelling emotionally exploitative? So I think that those are valid questions that we can ask about any of the coverage we produce. Now, we won't have much time to talk about these, but I thought it would be interesting using what we just talked about the coverage being sensational, the images horrifying, emotional exploitation, to look at just a handful of front pages that came out in the aftermath of the attack. And so, as I say, we don't have time to necessarily comment on all of these, but I think some of them are more matter of fact. Some of them are certainly interesting. I think the Evening Standard one on the left, I'm not sure what I think of that. I'll be interested to see what you think. I did find this one that I think we can all agree is the antithesis not only of peace journalism, but of good journalism as well. The Daily Express is I don't need you to tell me I'm not getting this right. It's obviously a tabloid, right? And it's obvious that the use of the language, the photo, and so on are simply sensational and exploitative. So we can agree, I'm guessing, that that's probably out of line. So here's some contact information for me. Obviously, I'll be here for the discussion as well. In conclusion, I would say this, that in times of war, that journalists are pushed to their professional and their ethical limits. That in these times, I think it's valuable to take a step back, to take a breath, and to examine how we report and the consequences of that reporting. Peace journalism, I believe, provides a valuable means for that self-reflection. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Steven. Thank you so much, Steven. And that was really, really extensive and informative. So let's start with the questions and interactive sessions right now. So I will take the first question from Christopher, and I think I would like Michael to start to take this one. And the question goes, what is the best route for a journalist to begin reporting on the ground on this crisis? I'm seeking to begin reporting there. Have been working as a journalist for several years. So how do you think, what is your advice for journalists that want to start reporting on this issue? And yes, so let's start from there, Michael.
Thank you. So the question is about reporting on the ground in the region.
Yes.
Right. Probably the first thing to do if you want to report from Israel on assignment is contact the Israeli Government Press Office. This is an Israeli government body that accredits journalists to work in the country. I've had to get accreditation for each of my assignments there in the past. There is a website, there is a process. You apply. I think you have to go to their office with your credentialing information from your news agency. And then once you have your press pass, which they will authorize for you, you're then free to go around the country to do your reporting while also following whatever instructions you get from the security services who might be in certain areas and might be blocking access for whatever security reasons. So, if you're accredited, you have your pass to work in Israel, you have to decide where you're going to base yourself. The two main cities are Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Both are in the center of the country. If you want to get around, it might be easier to base yourself in Tel Aviv in terms of driving or getting public transport from one place to another. It might be a bit easier than in Jerusalem, which is a bit further inland. Tel Aviv is on the coast. And then I would recommend reaching out once you're there to current and former Israeli officials, also making contact with Palestinian officials in the West Bank, in Ramallah and other places to get their connections and start talking to them. Going from Israel into the West Bank does require going through Israeli security checkpoints. And once you're in an area controlled by the Palestinian Authority, you are then under their responsibility in terms of security. So once you are there, you can network, I think, pretty quickly with other journalists who are on the ground, start to reach out to officials on both sides, journalists on both sides, to get ideas for where to go, who to talk to, and also just start talking to people around you and getting a sense of what they're feeling. It's difficult, obviously, when it comes to this conflict. You have a major theater of war in Gaza itself right now. And Israel, understandably, is not allowing any people to go from the Israeli side of the Gaza border into the Gaza Strip. There are a lot of Israeli security forces surrounding the Gaza Strip, getting ready apparently for some kind of major ground offensive potentially in the coming days. So there were crossings in the past, actual border crossings from which you could go from Israeli territory into the Gaza Strip. But those are off limits at the moment, given the situation. So getting into Gaza from Israeli territory is probably not going to happen. There is the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt. That border crossing has also been the subject of a lot of news lately. What Egypt will allow to go into Gaza and what can come from Gaza into Egypt. Not many people are going back and forth. It does seem as if it's also not so realistic to get into Gaza from the Egyptian side of that border either. So if you want to get the perspectives of people inside Gaza, it would really involve communicating with them in some way over the phone or social media. But there are UN agencies who are operating there. And one way to get sort of a path into knowing what's going on in Gaza is to talk to the UN workers who are there on the ground.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that insight. There is this issue. I'm paraphrasing like 3 questions right now. I'm talking about Nathaniel, Melika, and one other person, and they talked about the roles of journalists when referring to some of the key players in the crisis. And I think it's something we have to talk about. For instance, a media house can refer to a group as a terrorist group, and we are talking about being objective as journalists in the context of whose designation of the various key players should journalists project in their reports, so that their report will still be seen as objective. Let's start with Michael. Then for Steven, in the context of peace journalism, does such labeling matter, and how do we carefully navigate it? So we'll start with Michael, and Steven can take it right away.
Could you repeat your question, Paul? I didn't hear it.
Okay, my question is, in the context of peace journalism, how do we navigate labeling such that we stay objective?
Labels, okay.
Labels, yes. Thank you. Michael.
Okay, so the way VOA approaches this very sensitive topic is like this. The Hamas group, it is a US designated terrorist organization, and we can refer to it as such. But because we're not, Voice of America is editorially independent of whatever administration is in charge. So we don't take orders from the White House or the State Department in terms of how we do our labeling. We follow our own best practices, and what Voice of America can say is that the Hamas group, which is a US designated terror organization, did carry out a terrorist attack against Israel. And that is the language that I've been using, and that is the language that is consistent with our best practices. So while we acknowledge and we should report on what is the US view, because we are Voice of America, we also try to carefully calibrate the way we use language about terrorism. In this case, Voice of America specifically is referring to the attacks by the Hamas members who infiltrated into Israel, according to Israeli authorities, more than 1,000 of them, as Hamas infiltrators or members who carried out a terrorist attack against Israelis. And The casualties on the Israeli side are something like 1,400, I believe, is the current figure. Most of them were civilians. We know from the Israeli side that something like about 300 of the dead were members of the security services.
Steven?
Yeah, let's turn it over to Steven.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Michael said. To the greatest extent possible, peace journalism would say that we want to try to avoid labels as often as we can. So if we can, to generalize a bit, if we can say that people from this group committed this act, and this act, you know, to the greatest extent possible, I would say that we want our audience to draw their conclusion about, well, these are terrorist acts or they're not terrorist acts. But if someone from the government calls them terrorists, then of course we're quoting someone from the government. Malika said in the chat, which is right, that the BBC does not call Hamas a terrorist organization, and only if they're quoting someone doing that. So I would not say that we would never use the word terrorist. I just think that we need to be thoughtful about it the way that Michael is, and that we always have to remember that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I don't say that any way to excuse what Hamas did, but I think that we have to acknowledge that that is a perspective that some people have about Hamas.
Yes, thank you very much. There's also this question that I want your thoughts on, which goes beyond what is happening in Israel, Gaza, Palestine, West Bank, and the region in Israel, which is the choice of words of when to use the terminologies like genocide. I remember it's one of the questions, and I think somebody also mentioned it when we were trying to promote. I saw one of the comments that said, "This is not a war, this is a genocide."
So Paul, if I could jump in, I've had this discussion with a lot of journalists in a lot of different places, and they really educated me on the matter. And the way that I look at the use of the word genocide is that in my view, it's not a genocide until the United Nations calls it a genocide. So it's a word that's misused so often and misapplied so often that it's something that I would always avoid using.
Michael?
Yes, absolutely. Genocide has a kind of a legal definition according to international organizations, and VOA. I certainly wouldn't throw that label around in terms of saying one side is committing a genocide against the other. Any reference to genocide would be attributed to some kind of international body that does extensive investigation and analysis and passes judgments on whether such a crime occurred.
There is this quick follow-up on the true independent status of that definition itself, which is the influence of global superpowers on the definition. For instance, if you are covering the United Nations, some countries have veto power to say, to impact the conversation. How does the media, the journalism landscape prove its objectivity when its choice of those terminologies could directly or indirectly be impacted by key players that have permanent seats at the UN?
I could weigh in first. So, this is a question that's already very much in play, because you had in the UN Security Council just these last few days some resolutions proposed. There were vetoes by the United States of at least one or two of those resolutions that are related to this war. So the way I would approach it is the United States under President Biden has clearly been standing with Israel. It is labeled Hamas a terrorist organization, and it has supported what it says is Israel's right and even obligation to defend itself and to try to destroy Hamas's military capabilities. But that framing, that perspective is not shared by all of the world's great powers. As you can see, when there are disagreements in the UN Security Council among the 5 permanent members who can veto whatever resolution they don't like. So, you know, one could add some context here by saying other great world powers like China and Russia, for example, as far as I know, have not denounced Hamas as a terrorist organization, and they have not, let's say, sided with Israel as strongly as the Biden administration has done in this war. They tend to take the approach of wanting de-escalation, ceasefire, not putting the terrorist label on one side or the other. Those are all facts. And when Voice of America covers conflicts that have international ramifications, it's also, I think, useful for us to point out to our audience that other world powers have a different view. This is Russia's position. This is China's position, for example, and just reflect that factually in a story without saying, you know, the Chinese view, the Russian view is good or bad, just saying what it is.
And I think that's certainly the way to do it. I more broadly, I would say that as journalists and journalism organizations, that I regardless of where I am, whether I'm in Africa or the Middle East, or right now I'm in Eastern Europe, let's be aware of our own biases. And if we're coming from the West, we have a capitalist bias, we have a Western bias, where we have a patriarchal bias. And so we need to be aware of these biases at all times and do what we can to try to mitigate the impacts of these biases. As someone who's taught and lived in Africa in East Africa for quite a while, you can really see this bias seeping into all the reporting that's done out of the US and Europe and so on. So that's how I see that.
Yes, staying with you, Steven, there is this, we've been discussing this UN sticking with UN's definition, and we've also talked about the impact that the key players can have on defining some terminologies at the UN. And UN, to my best understanding, covering UN agencies falls under the umbrella of humanitarian. So what's the difference between peace journalism and humanitarian journalism? And I'll come to you, Michael. Michael, the question I wanted to answer is, when you described how journalists can do some reporting, what is your advice? Somebody is asking about accreditation for freelance journalists. So we take that question, you answer that question after Steven has answered the question on differentiating peace journalism from humanitarian journalism. Steven.
Well, I think peace journalism contains, I see humanitarian journalism as a subset of peace journalism. So you heard in my earlier presentation that where we concentrate quite a bit on giving a voice to the voiceless, on offering counter narratives about trouble spots, counter narratives that break out of Western perspectives. I think that's humanitarian journalism. I think humanitarian journalism shines a spotlight on humanitarian crises, maybe underreported crises, and that would be another example of a counter narrative. Certainly when we talk about reporting those who have been traumatized, there's a whole subset of peace and humanitarian journalism that talks about that. In my textbook, there's a chapter about reporting those who have been displaced. particularly refugees and IDPs. So I think how we report them responsibly is at the essence of what humanitarian journalism is. So I see humanitarian journalism and peace journalism as very closely related.
Micah?
The advice I would give if you're a freelancer who wants to be accredited for reporting work in Israel is that you would provide the accrediting authority, the Israeli government press office, with examples of your past work. Because usually what I've had to do is bring a letter signed by a superior specifying who I am as a journalist. I work for this news organization in this capacity. There's a signature on it. So having that letter of endorsement is always helpful when I apply. If you're a freelancer, you don't have someone to write a letter of endorsement for you, I think it may still be possible to get the accreditation if you, again, provide, let's say, an extensive selection of your past work so that the authorities can review and make a decision.
Hey, Paul, can I jump in here?
Yes.
A question just popped up that I really love, that I've given a lot of thought to. And the question is, which term is most correct, Israel-Gaza war or Israel-Hamas war? So, Michael, I'll be interested in what you think in a minute, but let me jump in and start. So as I've thought about this, my thought is that when you say Israel-Gaza war, that you're sort of indirectly leaving an impression that Israel is at war with all of Gaza. So I think that it makes it broader than it probably is. When you say Israel-Hamas war, to me that's more accurate and doesn't generalize the way that Israel-Gaza war does. Michael, what do you think?
Great point, Stephen. I would refer to it as an Israel-Hamas war for the sake of accuracy, given that when you look at the statements that Israeli leaders have made, they're all, when they're talking about their war aims, talking specifically about the Hamas organization itself and wanting to, they use a variety of language, eliminate it, destroy it, remove its governing capabilities, its military arsenals, and that's where it ends, usually, when they talk about what they're trying to do in this war. Some Israeli officials have also been saying that they don't want to harm innocent people in Gaza. It's not their objective. That is their point of view. They're not trying to target civilians in Gaza. I think they recognize that there are many Palestinians who don't support Hamas. And if you look at the evacuation order that the Israeli authorities sent to people who live in the Gaza Strip, they told people living in the north to go toward the south. So all of those declared statements from the Israeli side, to me, make it seem more accurate to call this an Israel-Hamas war rather than Israel fighting to somehow destroy Gaza as a whole with its 2 million people.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll come back with your last remarks. I know we've gone really beyond the time allocated for this conversation, but if you will, you can still engage in the chat box, interacting with our audience. I can see a lot of conversations already. The chat section is really, really interesting. But for everybody, I would like you can see that there are lots of cautious actions that you have to take. There are lots of conscious actions that you have to take. And but we have this tip. We have the International Journalists Network recently posted this publication that talks about the tips to consider when you are reporting on these developments. I've put the link in the chat box. And so the first thing that they recommended is that you should, as a journalist, you should report the facts once you verify them. The second point recommendation is that you should beware of disinformation and consume media with a critical eye. All the key players in this crisis, in this war, they are active on social media. They have supporters. They have people that are actively pushing their message. So you, as a journalist, you have to be careful of the kinds of comments that you are using and what you are trying to believe as independent. Then there is this saying that they also recommended that you should acknowledge the human toll and the trauma involved. We need to start looking at, when we talked about the broader aspect of reporting, mental health is an aspect. If you are a health journalist, we need to talk about mental health aspect, the trauma involved. Those are kind of stories that you can do beyond just talking about the tit-for-tat bombings and the number of explosions that are happening. Then, which connected to the fourth point, which is you should learn the wider context so that you can better follow the story. You should read extensively on who the key players are. If you go to the link that I shared, we have a link that explains Hamas, that talks about the leader of Israel and other key elements, the history of Gaza. You as a journalist that is reporting on these issues, you should know this information. I know if I wake Michael up at night, Michael, give me 20 minutes talk on Gaza. Michael, can you do it or not?
Just tell me when. Just give me the time and place.
So if you are trying to report on an issue like that, you need to know those issues inside out. You shouldn't be learning on the way, just like the people you are trying to inform. You need to devote yourself into learning a lot about this region. And also, you should also be able to know how to report on war crimes. So I've put your priority should be on safety and well-being. And because a lot of journalists have died in the latest chapter of this crisis, and it's important that journalists continue to keep themselves safe. So this link that I just put in the chat box talks a lot extensively about what you need to do, how you need to comport yourself, and starts you on this journey of getting yourself properly informed about what is happening. I'm really, really, really sorry. And we cannot take all the questions, but looking at the chat box, I know we can see that people are really happy with, they really found this session worthy. And Natalia said, I really appreciate this webinar. Thank you, SCFJ, you're welcome. And everybody really appreciated our panelists. You can see that you've been instrumental in helping us form good opinion, knowing a lot about these developments. I'm really, really sorry. We still have some questions that are still popping up, but I'm really sorry. That's how far we can take today. I will start with the last remarks. Let's from Steven, so what are your last remarks regarding this issue that we've chosen? What should be the take-home message from attendees?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I think that the take-home message for both journalists and for those who consume media is just to be thoughtful, to consider the impact and the consequences of the journalism that we produce and that we consume, and to be analytical and critical in all that we do, and that to consider the consequences of the media that we consume and produce. And remember the phrase, are we pouring gasoline on the fire? And I think that I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Will you be okay with sharing your slides with me so that I can pass it on to the attendees? Is that something you'll be?
Of course.
So we are going to be sharing the slides for this presentation. If you're a member of our Facebook forum, I'm going to drop that link here. But before I share the link, we want to hear from Michael. What are Michael's last remarks?
I guess I would emphasize one thing that is very much a strong VOA principle, which is sourcing. We have a two-source rule, at VOA for reporting all big developments, especially in a war, in a conflict. If an incident has happened either in Gaza or in Israel, there were casualties. We try to find at least 2 credible sources reporting basically the same information before VOA can say that this incident happened. It's a fact. So try to establish at least 2 sources for every major incident that you are covering, and also be very careful about the kinds of sources that you use. Try to identify, draw up a list, just create a document and put a whole bunch of links to news sites that are credible, that have good information, good reporting from the conflict. I'm happy to share later on, if anyone wants, what I think are the best Israeli news sources, because that's more of my expertise. From a variety of political perspectives and across the sort of Israeli ideological spectrum, there are a variety of sources that are quite credible from the Israeli side that I can share.
Yes.
And then sources that are more like from the Israeli official, military, governmental sources that are also important sources of information about this conflict, and also some journalists who are very active on social media and who have good reputations, and who also are sharing information about what's happening in Israel and also what's happening in Gaza and in Lebanon. They're more tapped in to some of those Arab sources than I am. But I think if you can create that list and consult it, then you are better informed when it comes to producing your own journalism.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Steven. Thank you so much. Our awesome audience, you've been quite engaging. I'm curious to know, Amanda, in the chat box, which media organization do you work with? I'm curious to know. And okay, the world. Okay, thank you so much for your contributions. And so we are going. I know there have been lots of questions regarding sharing this video. I know Amanda wants to share this video with your newsroom. I want to encourage you, if you are not a member of our Facebook forum, please be part of it. I just put the link in the chat box. Just click that link. It takes you to that forum, request to join. And I'm going to add you because by tomorrow, we should have the link to the YouTube video ready for you to share with your newsroom. And I encourage everybody on this call to ensure that you widely disseminate the information that you've learned from today's session. The goal of journalists is to accurately report stories. And anytime is something that I'm passionately concerned about, which is ensuring that journalists get it right as much as possible, and these stories are properly reported. And this is why we continue to do our best to empower your skills and enable you to be better at doing what you do. So on behalf of the entire team at the International Center for Journalists, I want to thank you very much, everybody that started from the beginning to the end. I know this will be an engaging session, and you guys did not disappoint. You were actively engaging throughout the session, and the comments and the feedback showed that you really benefited from everything that we've put together today. I know there are still lots of issues around this war that you still want us to help you with. And specifically, I want to specifically thank Steven and Michael for accepting the very urgent invitation. I'm humbled, and I really appreciate you for accepting our invitation. Although it came quite urgent, we are not like that. We always plan things around, but the circumstance around this particular make us to do it. I want to thank the VOA for our continual partnership and helping us to empower other journalists by making their experts available to us. So that is where we draw the curtain on today's edition of our webinar. And I hope you've learned one or two things. We will be sharing information on the next webinar. We have a webinar next week that is targeted at media entrepreneurs, so we look forward to that. But I encourage you to join our Facebook group and be part of our conversation. To learn more about the International Center for Journalists and our projects and our initiatives, please check out the International Center for Journalists website on www.icfj.org, and to access more resources like the one I shared with you that was published by the International Journalists Network, I encourage you to check out International Journalists Network's website on www.ijnet.org. So that's it from me. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye from me.
Bye-bye.